As a composer, what are some of the things you look for in working with a filmmaker? Like, what makes it easier, for me to come to you? Do you like seeing, let's say, like a rough cut, or do you want 100% like lock cut? What helps you?
Well, ideally, whether a client sends either a small section or the full film, doesn't matter. As long as the cut is relatively locked, the VFX don't have to be in there, and the coloring and whatnot, or even the sound effects for that matter. But it does help. But if the cut and the individual scenes are locked exactly where they need to be, then the music can be either written and then sequenced as a demo, or if the demo is the final version.
Mm-hmm.
All that is locked in, and they just have to drop it in at the time plate. So
Okay.
That's preferable.
Do you only work with lock cuts, or are you fine? I know when we work on YouTube videos, it's like, hey, this is an estimate, like 2-minute video. It might be 2.5 by the end. Like, Is that frustrating to have it change?
Well, I've done both, and it is a little frustrating because cutting off half a second somewhere for an editor is really just a click of a button, boom, they're done. And everything else falls in place. But to do that with music, it's very, very different, especially if you're dealing with a lot of individual synced frames and moments throughout the film.
Right.
So yeah, it can be frustrating.
What are things that you're looking for? I think a lot of times filmmakers describe their music like it needs to sound epic or sounds like Pirates of the Caribbean. Does that help you? Or are those terms like frustrating to work with? What what vision from the filmmaker do you need to translate it into music?
Well, this I think is part of a larger conversation of what's in the industry is called temp tracks, where a director will take something from an existing score, pop it in their editor, and kind of edit around it.
Yeah.
And the good thing about temp tracks is it gives a very clear vision to the composer what the director wants. Because if they want something from Pirates of the Caribbean, they're specifically asking for some sort of rhythm or some sort of feeling. And that can be very helpful, but it can also be very detrimental because a lot of times when dealing with independent film composers, you will almost always get a better product when using a full Hollywood budget music, something that was produced in Hollywood versus something that was produced in a bedroom or a small studio, just because you're working with live musicians versus samples. And so sometimes film directors get stuck on the temp music. Instead of working with the composer to get something unique from the composer, they're trying to get the composer to do something that someone else has already done. So it's like, why are you dealing with the composer? Like, it would be better for you to just pay some money and get some licensing to use the music that does fit, rather than forcing a composer into a certain hole.
Sure.
So there's upside, downside.
So what do you like then the filmmaker to tell you? And it probably varies from composer to composer, but what is like the thing that sparks the theme or the music?
I would just say to any sort of director trying to work with a composer is, the composer is pulling things out of the film. They're not adding. They're taking the ideas that are in the film and accentuating them in musical terms. It's like coloring or illustrating.
Sure. So how do review processes work for you? A lot of times do people say like, scratch that, let's do something else? Do you just start giving them a theme and then build upon that and say, like working with the client more? How does that work?
Sometimes on smaller budgets, it's really hard for composers to want to say, well, I just put 5 hours into this 5 minutes of music, and now you want to scratch it, so that's going to be at least another 5 hours. But the budget doesn't change because you're not really always paid by the hour. Sometimes you're paid. So it depends on the project, and it depends on the sort of relationship you have with the film composer or the film director and the composer. Because if the film composer has a bit of standing with the film director already, they can say, look, I think this is how this scene should go, as opposed to the director always just sending down orders.
Yeah. How do you like that relationship between director and composer to be? Is it talking to them pretty often and going scene by scene, or is it overall you start with a theme for the whole movie and then you adjust that and tweak it and then go do the rest by yourself?
Well, the relationship needs to be one of understanding. A film composer is saying, all right, you've given me something, this is your artistic language, and now I'm going to take my artistic language and insert it into the film. but in the context of the film. So obviously it is not outside the bounds of a film director's job to say, this is completely inappropriate for the scene, I'd like something else. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the director needs to understand you have a new voice that is being contributed. It's up to the director to know what they're working with before they get in the film composing process. So that's where that relationship needs to be. They need to know who the composer is, they need to know what the workflow is, and they need to know what their music sounds like. Because realistically, if you're always correcting and telling the composer to change, then you probably should have gotten a different film composer to start with.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are some of the top things that come to mind if you could tell filmmakers, hey, this is what you should do when you work with a composer and this is what you should not do? Do you have like a list of things?
The number one thing to remember is when you're directing or making a film, that's kind of where all your energy is. Whereas with a film composer, they might be working on a lot of different projects at the same time.
Okay.
So to assume that the amount of energy that you're putting into it is equal on the part of the film composer, that can lead to some miscommunication.
Right.
So that's the main thing. It's just realizing the balance there.
So what do you do with that? If you're working with clients, do you say, hey, I give you this amount of hours per day, you can call me between these hours? Are you like very specific? Or is it just feeling it out?
Yes, it's a lot of both, but I have started to get to the point where I'm like, okay, I can maximum, even just for creative purposes. I try not to put more than 4 hours a day in a project because I hit that wall after working on the same project for a while.
Sure.
Just, like, I can't creatively contribute. The other thing is, back to what I was saying about the locked cuts, is that small changes over here can affect something that happens, several minutes down a queue.
How do filmmakers need to approach composers when it comes to pricing? Do they pay per project? Is it an hourly? Is there a standard, or is it everyone's different?
Everyone is different, but I think the most common is budget-based. I mean, every film has a budget, and sound and music and whatnot should be in the budget. Either the money of the budget is what the composer is being paid. Oftentimes it's a percentage. I usually like 5 to 10%, because sound and music is such a big part of most productions. It's like 5 to 10% is a decent rate. Yeah, so either the composer just gets what the budget is, or the budget is given to the composer as a means of financing however the music is going to be recorded or produced. Either it buys new equipment, or it buys live musicians, and then the composer might charge an extra per hour rate. It just depends on what sort of level the musician is at, because everyone is different. Like, someone who's been composing for 5 years can't reasonably charge the same for someone who's been composing their whole life, for example. So
thanks for hanging out with me and Andrew. We'll see you in another film school lesson. Peace.